All that glisters is not gold. Often have you heard that told. Many a man his life hath sold, but my outside to behold. Gilded tombs do worms enfold. Had you been as wise as bold.
Had you been as wise as bold. Young in limbs in judgment bold. Your answer had not been enscrolled. Fare ye well, your suit is cold. So what do you think our warlock friend Shakespeare is trying to say here? Yes, all that glitters is not gold, as you hath been told. And with his magic he has something more to unfold. That there is no shine even in glittering gold. For if you got to know where all this gold and wealth came from, you would never stop washing your hands tenfold. So horrible is the story of capitalist accumulation of wealth, full of blood, crime, and the degradation of women, like myself. This European story is a road bridging feudalism to capitalism from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Ultimately, it led to the immiseration of the working class. Primitive accumulation is a road paved with war, land privatization, eviction, rent increases, higher taxation, usury, and religion. It is I, Lady Hexerai, once again, to bring you the good news about witchcraft. Today we'll explore the second chapter of the book Caliban and the Witch, Woman, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, by philosopher Sylvia Federici. This chapter is entitled The Accumulation of Labor and the Degradation of Women, Constructing Difference in the Transition to Capitalism. Oh, what a mouthful! I need some potion. I call my wine potions. For this first video, we'll only be looking at the end of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, according to the principle of primitive accumulation. I have already told you in the first video about the innumerable internal and external crises that the feudal society faced. There was a strong reaction and many responses to this crisis. The strongest of all these responses was the development of a completely new economic and social system, capitalism. Sister Federici says that capitalism wasn't the only response, as there had been many put forth to solve the crises of feudalism. Quote, throughout Europe, vast communalistic social movements and rebellions against feudalism had offered the promise of a new egalitarian society built on social equality and cooperation. However, by 1525, their most powerful expression, the Peasant War in Germany, or as Peter Blickel called it, the Revolution of the Common Man, was crushed. Over 100,000 peasants were massacred during the Peasant War. Then, in 1525, the Anabaptists suffered a downfall with division of its own leaders, who had taken a patriarchal turn by imposing polygamy that caused women to revolt against them, and then later they ended in a great bloodbath by the opposite forces. Despite these victories by the nobility, the church, and the new town merchant class, feudalism was doomed. It could no longer reproduce itself. As we spoke in the previous video, feudalism was based on the relation of a vassal to a lord. The lowest yet most numerous vassals were the serfs. The social relation of serfdom was a specific kind of social division, vastly different than the ones that exist today. Serfs were given a small plot of land called a fief to live and grow crops on in fealty, literally in fee, to a lord. Serfs were taught that obedience and service to their lords without question would lead to the kingdom of heaven. Yet, back in the real world, most serfs had no possibility of upward mobility. With the chance to rise above their station practically non-existent, there was small incentive to do more than what was required. Feudal wealth was also very different from today. The church and nobility had its coffers full of gold and silver, which it either kept in its strong boxes or used in ornaments for altars. It was a great fortune, but idle capital, not continuously at work as fortunes are today. Whatever money the nobility had was motionless, fixed, dead. Commutation changed all this in the 13th century. Commutation, where peasants were paid wages for the work they owed to their lord and the lord charged them money rent, shattered the closed economies of the feudal system. Now, any crops beyond what was needed could be sold and in return serfs could get money. The serfs were not entirely at home with this use of money, but they were getting more and more familiar with it. Commutation created the first primitive engines of capitalism, as capital began to move beyond the manorial village. Large numbers of peasants began to move about, sell or bequeath their land, although they had to make certain payments for doing so. Commutation also caused many serfs to lose their land. Serfs would go into debt to pay for their rents, eventually becoming landless. No longer bounded to the land, they moved to the re-emerging cities for new opportunities. The force of change swept over Europe and gave it a new face. As we said earlier, feudalism was doomed. Doomed! Yes, that's right. On top of commutation, there was the devastation of the Black Death. It washed off more than half of the peasant population. Labor was more valuable than ever. As Sister Federici states, quote, "The real wage increased by 100%. Prices declined by 33%. Rents also declined. The length of the working day decreased, and a tendency appeared towards local self-sufficiency. Evidence of a chronic disaccumulation trend in this period is also found in the pessimism of the contemporary merchants and landowners, and the measures which the European states adopted to protect markets, suppress competition, and force people to work at the conditions imposed. As the entries in the registers of the feudal manors recorded, the work was not worth the breakfast. The feudal economy could not reproduce itself, nor could a capitalist society have evolved from it. The self-sufficiency in the new high-wage regime allowed for the wealth of the people, but excluded the possibility of capitalist wealth. It's not like feudalism didn't try. There was an attempt at a return to serfdom after commutation, but it was strenuously resisted. Only in Eastern Europe, where the population was especially low, did serfdom reappear. Attempts were made, especially in Italy, at bringing back chattel slavery, but the conditions simply didn't exist to break the will of the serfs. All was for naught. Sister Federici says, quote, "It was in response to this crisis that the European ruling class launched the global offensive that in the course of at least 3 centuries was to change the history of the planet, laying the foundations of a capitalist world system in the relentless attempt to appropriate new sources of wealth, expand its economic basis, and bring new workers under its command." Yet capitalism was not at a point where it could reproduce itself either. This period, the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, was when the so-called transition from feudalism to capitalism occurred. We say so-called because the term transition means a slow, gradual process, but this change was so abrupt and lethal that historians have labeled this period the Iron Age, the Age of Plunder, the Age of the Whip. Enlightenment thinkers and capitalist historians would have you believe that history and knowledge move progressively from ignorance to enlightenment. There is an inevitability to history in their minds. But, as Sister Federici said earlier, it was not a foregone conclusion that capitalism would emerge on top. For 3 centuries, there were bloody and unending conflicts between different groups of exploiters and exploitees. All witches know that history is not a straight line. Here, Sister Federici is agreeing with our warlock friend Michel Foucault. Foucault said in an interview entitled Truth and Power, "It seemed to me that in certain empirical forms of knowledge like biology, political economy, psychiatry, medicine, etc., the rhythm of transformation doesn't follow the smooth, continuous schemas of development which are normally accepted. The great biological image of a progressive maturation of science still underpins a good many historical analyses. It does not seem to me to be pertinent to history." History isn't smooth. It's messy, discontinuous, occurs through innumerable micro-struggles, starts in fits and bursts and annihilates in a second. The science of the Enlightenment led to phrenology, the science of studying cranial size to understand the psychology of someone, to scientific racism like eugenics, which directly led to the horrors of the Holocaust. How progressive. Sister Federici only uses the term transition in a chronological sense for defining this period between feudalism and capitalism that arose in the 15th and 16th centuries. In this change, the exploitation and the subjugation of the common peoples would worsen at home and spread abroad in the forms of slavery. How silly of me! I forgot to explain what capitalism was! Here you go. Beware, for you are up for an informative ride. But I warn you, just as curiosity kills the cat, knowledge can kill a witch. Boy! Boy, come here! Explain to the audience what capitalism is.
Boy? I'm no boy. I'll have you know I'm over 200 years...
I've lived over 1,000 years, have seen the greatest empires rise and fall, and many a boy has been felled by my spells alone. Obey your seniors and do as you're commanded.
Yes, as you command.
And get me more potion!
Well, you see, capitalism is made up of two groups, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is made up of the vast majority of people who have to sell their labor in order to survive, while the bourgeoisie are the capitalists which hoard wealth and exploit the proletariat. All value is derived from labor. It is the capitalist which concentrates and manages the labor in such a way that the surplus increase in value from labor is expropriated from the proletariat and added to the coffers of the boss. Yes. Capital is merely dead, surplus labor, stolen by the wealthy. We reach an interesting problem. For the accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalist production. Capitalist production presupposes the availability of considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of commodity producers. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn around in a never-ending circle of some sort, which we can only get out of by assuming some primitive accumulation, which precedes capitalist accumulation, an accumulation which is not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. Ultimately, capitalism could not have emerged without 1. A prior concentration of capital, land, and labor. And 2, contrary to the vulgar economists like Adam Smith, capitalist wealth was not created by the abstinence of the rich, but by divorcing the workers from the means of production.
That's enough, child! While it was not inevitable that capitalism would triumph, in order for capitalism to successfully transition, it was necessary that primitive accumulation occur. From here, Sister Federici departs from Marx in greatly expanding our understanding of primitive accumulation. She argues the following points. 1. The expropriation of European workers from their means of subsistence, and the enslavement of Native Americans and Africans to the mines and plantations of the New World were not the only means by which a world proletariat was formed and accumulated. 2. This process required the transformation of the body into a work machine, and the subjugation of women to the reproduction of the workforce. Most of all, it required the destruction of the power of women, which, in Europe as in America, was achieved through the extermination of witches. 3. Primitive accumulation, then, was not simply an accumulation and concentration of exploitable workers and capital. It was also an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class, whereby hierarchies built upon gender as well as race and age became constitutive of class rule and the formation of the modern proletariat. 4. We cannot, therefore, identify capitalist accumulation with the liberation of the worker, female or male, as many Marxists have done, and see the advent of capitalism as a moment of historical progress. On the contrary, capitalism has created more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement, as it had planted into the body of the proletariat deep divisions that have served to intensify and conceal exploitation. It is in great part because of these imposed divisions, especially those between women, like myself, and men, that capitalist accumulation continues to devastate life in every corner of the planet. There were 3 main objectives that had to be fulfilled in order for capitalism to transition into existence. A. Create a more disciplined workforce. B. Diffuse social protest. And C. Fix workers to jobs forced on them. During this time of no longer feudalism and not quite capitalism, the best description of the economic system is mercantilism. Mercantilism is often dismissed by capitalist historians as a vulgar phase, But the brutality of this vulgarity is exactly what made it necessary to primitive accumulation. We will go into greater detail later, but Sister Federici describes mercantilism as follows. Invented workhouses, punished vagabonds, transported criminals to the Americas, and invested in the slave trade. Asserted the utility of poverty, while condemning idleness as a social plague. It was intensive in that it involved totalitarian regimes to extract a maximum amount of work, but it was also extensive, as it studied the reproduction of labor, expanded population, expanded the army and workforce. It defined humans as machines or raw materials. It created pronatalist theories, punishing contraception, abortion, infanticide, and non-procreative sex. It forced male doctors to be present at birth, marginalizing midwives, thereby leading to women losing control over reproductive functions. Women, like myself, became enslaved to procreation. What was previously a private affair became public, controlled by men and the state. Just as essential to primitive accumulation was the colonization of the Americas and the Caribbean. Colonizers were able to use methods of discipline on enslaved people which even European workers did not experience. Sister Federici maintains that capitalism itself could not have taken off without the blood of the natives and imported slaves. It was not just the land stolen or the absolute labor expropriated that created the foundations of capitalism, but also the knowledge of the best methods to maximize profit. Quote, "The plantation system was crucial for capitalist development, not only because of the immense amount of surplus labor that was accumulated from it, but because it set a model of labor management, export-oriented production, economic integration, and international division of labor that have since become paradigmatic for capitalist class relations. With its immense concentration of workers and its captive labor force uprooted from its homeland, unable to rely on local support, the plantation prefigured not only the factory, but also the later use of immigration and globalization to cut the cost of labor. In particular, the plantation was a key step in the formation of an international division of labor that, through the production of consumer goods, integrated the work of slaves into the reproduction of the European workforce, while keeping enslaved and waged workers geographically and socially divided. The knowledge, and the power that came with it, of capitalism found its origin in the New World, and guaranteed capitalism's ultimate triumph by the 19th century. Every method used to discipline the European working class was used 100-fold or more in the Americas. Whether natives, imported African slaves, or exported indentured servants, all resisted the brutalities of colonization. There was often solidarity amongst these three groups that threatened the colonial order at its core. We see in our warlock friend Shakespeare's The Tempest one such plot against the colonizing order.
As I told thee before, I am subject to a tyrant, a sorcerer, that by his cunning hath cheated me of the island. I say by sorcery he got this isle. From me he got it. If thy greatness will revenge it on him, for I know thou darest, but this thing dare not.
Well, that's most certain.
Thou shalt be lord of it, and I'll serve thee.
How now shall this be compassed? Canst thou bring me to the party?
Yea, my lord, I'll yield him thee asleep, or thou mayst knock a nail into his head. Why, as I told thee, 'tis a custom with him in the afternoon to sleep. There thou mayst brain him, having first seized his books, or with a log batter his skull, or punch him with a stake, or cut his weasand with thy knife. Remember first to possess his books, for without them he's but a sot as I am, nor hath not one spirit to command. They all do hate him as rootedly as I. Burn but his books. And that most deeply to consider is the beauty of his daughter. He himself calls her a nonpareil. I never knew a woman, but only Sycorax my dam, and she. But she as far surpasseth Sycorax, as great does least.
Is it so brave a lass?
Aye, lord. She will become thy bed, I warrant, and bring thee forth brave brood.
Monster, I will kill this man. His daughter and I shall be king and queen, save our graces. And Trinculo and thyself shall be my viceroys.
Within this half hour will he be asleep. Wilt thou destroy him then?
Aye, on mine honor.
Thou makes me merry! I am full of pleasure!
In The Tempest, a failed slave rebellion by Caliban is thwarted by Prospero, showing the futility of rebelling against the masters.
Most gracious sir, there are yet missing of your company some few odd lads that you remember not.
Every man shift for all the rest, and let no man take care for himself, for all is but fortune. Oh, coraggio, bully monster, coraggio!
If these be true spies which I wear in my head, here's a goodly sight.
Oh, Setebos! These be brave spirits indeed! How fine my master is! I am afraid he will chastise me.
What things are these, my lord Antonio? Will money buy 'em?
Very like. One of them is a plain fish, and no doubt marketable.
Mark but the badges of these men, my lords, and then say if this be true. This misshapen knave, his mother was a witch, and one so strong that can control the moon, make flows and ebbs, and deal in her command without her power. These three had robbed me, and this demi-devil, for he's a bastard one, had plotted with them to take my life. Two of these fellows you must know and own. This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine.
I shall be pinched to death.
This representation by our warlock friend no doubt expresses the very real anxieties and fears of colonizers on both sides of the Atlantic. Colonizers had to do everything possible to divide and conquer. Indentured servitude eventually fell out of favor, as it simply could not create the workforce needed to fill capitalism's endless hunger. Slave labor was far more stable, as you never had to free slaves, and enslaved people had less rights than indentured servants. The concept of whiteness began to form in order to separate the Europeans from the Africans and natives. The very concepts of racial differences, a distinction separate though descended from ethnicity and nationality, is a purely capitalist invention that took centuries to develop. It started with Columbus getting lost and discovering a new world in 1492, and culminated in a complex, sophisticated study of alleged biological and cultural differences between races in the 19th century. Laws were made criminalizing any fraternization between the races, and whiteness became a psychological wage for whites. Yes, your circumstances are abominable, but at least you're free, unlike those inferior black slaves over there. Over the centuries, whiteness became synonymous with freedom, while blackness became synonymous with slavery. That's all for this video, my dears. I, Lady Hexerai, will see all you lovely people in the next video. Bye. Special thanks to you, Srepet, for supporting the channel on Patreon.